Hey there, historians! Welcome back to U.S. History. We've been looking at westward expansion. In a previous lesson, we learned that the United States purchased Louisiana in 1803. They also purchased Florida from Spain in 1819, but today we'll be focused on the Texas Revolution of 1836. Believe it or not, Texas was an independent country before it joined the Union as a state in 1845. Our objectives are to explain why thousands of Americans moved to Mexico in the 1820s, describe the conflict that led to a war for Texas independence, and summarize how Texans won their independence from Mexico and the consequences for its independence. In the early 19th century, many Latin American countries rebelled against European rule, declaring independence. For Mexico, this was achieved in 1821. In a treaty with Spain, Americans had agreed to a southern border, giving up claims to Texas. So Texas became Mexico's territory in 1821. What do you think that means for the treaty that the United States made with Spain? Do you think Americans should honor this agreement now that the lands belonged to Mexico, or do you think a new treaty should be made? Either way, based on what we learned about Cherokee lands, I'm sure you can imagine that Americans thought the border was more of a recommendation than a rule and were eager to move in. From Mexico's perspective, Texas was very sparsely populated, distant from other regions, and divided by mountains. It was a land that was difficult to defend against the fierce Comanche warriors, and it was vulnerable to both Spanish reconquest and to American claims. So the new government gave empresarios, or land developers, contracts to find settlers and sell them the land, on the condition that they recognized it as Mexican territory. They believed settlement would help with defending Texas from the Spanish, Americans, and indigenous peoples like the Comanche. In 1826, an American, Stephen F. Austin, secured a contract to bring 500 families to Texas, provided they were Catholics with good morals. In the next 5 years, that's exactly what he did. It was an easy job, as, Americans were eager for cheap land to use for cotton farming. Over 20,000 Americans migrated to Texas, most of them from southern states. By 1830, the Anglo, or white American population in Texas, was 4 times the number of Tejanos, or Mexican people living in the region. In 1824, a Mexican constitution was ratified, establishing a federal government and state governments, similar to the government in the United States. Anglos liked this government structure because they favored local rights and a limited central government. But in 1829, the federal government freed all enslaved people living in Mexico, and by 1830, it prohibited bringing more enslaved people into Mexico. And remember, these laws applied to Texas too. The 500 families who had settled in Texas had brought over 1,000 enslaved men, women, and children, and more were on the way. As Southerners, most of them didn't believe there was anything wrong with slavery and didn't want to give up the practice. Anglos believed that states and local governments should have the power to decide whether to allow slavery, like they did in the United States. And they saw enslaved people as their property. So, if the government freed them, that would be like taking their property. They didn't give up their slaves when the Mexican government required it. Instead, they sent Stephen Austin to Mexico City to negotiate with the federal government, hoping to win more local rights for people in Texas, including the right to own enslaved people. In 1833, a general, Antonio López de Santa Anna, took control of the Mexican government. He put Austin in jail, infuriating Anglos in Texas. Santa Anna also dissolved all state governments, which removed any local rights Texans had to begin with. He even began raising an army to suppress their calls for more local control. General Santa Anna was famous for suppressing rebellions with force. Early skirmishes went well for Mexican forces. There just weren't enough Texan soldiers to put up much of a resistance. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico. Their attitude was best summed up by Colonel W.B. Travis, who said,
"I shall never surrender nor retreat. Victory or death."
But around 150 men, including American legends Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, defended themselves at an old Spanish mission called the Alamo. After a 13-day siege, every man there was killed. None were spared. Be on the lookout for more info about the Alamo in your PDF. Later, in Goliad, 400 men surrendered to a larger Mexican force, but Santa Anna had them killed anyway, to send a message that the rebellion must end. Santa Anna's strategy backfired. News about the slaughters at the Alamo and Goliad strengthened the resistance effort. Many Americans traveled to Texas to help defend it against a violent dictator. Defenders rallied behind General Sam Houston, the former governor of Tennessee. In a huge clash, Houston's army met Mexican forces in the Battle of San Jacinto. Americans surprised the enemy, shouting, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" and captured General Santa Anna himself. Houston forced him to sign a treaty recognizing the Republic of Texas as an independent nation. In the wake of the Texas Revolution, Sam Houston was named President of the Republic of Texas, and San Jacinto was renamed. The city is now known as Houston, Texas. To protect themselves from a potential reconquest, the Republic formed the Texas Rangers, a defensive army that patrolled the borders. Texas voted to ask Congress to become a U.S. state in 1836. But President Andrew Jackson opposed the idea for two reasons. Firstly, while Texas acted as an independent state, Mexico did not yet recognize this status because Santa Anna was forced to give up the lands at gunpoint. Jackson did not want to go to war with Mexico over disputed territory. Jackson also worried about the debate that would unfold in Congress about bringing another slave state into the Union, a topic we'll revisit in a future lesson. For the next 9 years, Texas would remain an independent republic, waiting for the U.S. government to change its mind and annex, or take control of, the territory. Let's recap. Americans were encouraged to settle in northeastern Mexico to defend those lands. They took the offer of cheap land and brought in many enslaved people with them. The Mexican government outlawed slavery, and later dictator Santa Anna disbanded state governments. A conflict over states' rights led Texans to declare independence and fight for their freedom. They won the war against Mexico's disorganized, overzealous dictator in 1836 and formed the Texas Rangers to prevent a potential reconquest. Although Texans asked to become a U.S. state, American leaders were reluctant to annex the territory for years, afraid of a Mexican war and the expansion of slavery into new states. Despite the political delays, Americans were still flocking to Texas in large numbers. Even the government couldn't prevent their spirit of westward expansion. Stay tuned for more on Texas in a future lesson. We're not done with the Texans just yet. Until then, historians, remember to always be clever.
Hey!